Hey everybody, we're on day 36 of our Bible in a year. We are reading through Leviticus 13, 14, and 15 today in the Christian Standard Bible. If you want to follow along, you should be able to pull this translation up. There's several different websites that you should be able to use: Bible.com, BibleGateway.com, BlueLetterBible.com. There's tons. If you're interested in a physical copy, I have a link in the description to a CSB Apologetic Study Bible, and I actually have a link to a video reviewing that. And it's the Bible I typically recommend for people, especially if you are newer. It's easier to read. It's a solid translation, and that specific one has a lot of apologetic stuff in it, which is very, very helpful, very informative. I've absolutely loved it since I got it. So, if that's of interest to you, those are in the description. If not, no worries. But we will jump straight into it. We're in, like I said, Leviticus 13 today. That is where we will be starting. So, Leviticus 13, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, when a person has swelling, scab, or spot on the skin of his body, and it may be a serious disease on the skin of his body, he is to be brought to the priest, Aaron, or to one of his sons, the priests. The priest will examine the sore on the skin of his body. If the hair in the sore has turned white and the sore appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is in fact a serious skin disease. After the priest examines him, he must pronounce him unclean, but if the spot on the skin of his body is white and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and the hair in it has not turned white, the priest will quarantine the stricken person for 7 days. The priest will then re-examine him on the seventh day. If he sees that the sore remains unchanged and has not spread on the skin, the priest will quarantine him for another 7 days. The priest will examine him again on the seventh day. If the sore has faded and has not spread on the skin, the priest is to pronounce him clean. It is a scab. The person is to wash his clothes and will become clean. But if the scab spreads further on his skin after he has presented himself to the priest for his cleaning or for his cleansing, he is to present himself again to the priest. The priest will examine him, and if the scab has spread on the skin, then the priest must pronounce him unclean. He has a serious skin disease. So real quick, a little side note here, and I don't think I mentioned this yesterday. I don't remember. I think I started recording this episode earlier yesterday because I wasn't sure how I was going to feel today, and I ended up not being able to get through it. So I may have mentioned it on that, but there is kind of a cool little tidbit. So most people are familiar with the Black Plague, the bubonic plague. When that was ravaging Europe, we saw that it actually did not seem to have as big impact on Jewish communities, and a lot of it was because of the rules and regulations they had in place as far as disease and things like what we're going to see here. So I talked yesterday about kind of some of these rules and laws seem to have a kind of a practical reason behind it. God actually trying to prevent a lot of death, a lot of illness, a lot of disease, just practically. And I think this is another example of that. I think that what we see with the Black Plague is a good example of that. But I think this is a good example of, we often see God working in His creation. So a lot of people always think that God is when God does something, it's this big, huge, miraculous event, and it has to go completely against the laws of nature and what we see common in the world. But I think that is the exception. That is why those events, when they do happen, are so miraculous, because they are the exception. I think there is a lot of times where the miracle is us trusting God and God having provision and sovereignty, and seeing what's going to happen and giving us instruction, like we see here. I think it's very, very practical, and it's no less a miracle. I was even last night. I started feeling really, really rough with my throat and just congestion, sickness, terrible stuff. And I ended up I took some ibuprofen, and it started kicking in, and I started feeling better. And so as I was laying there, I had been trying to go to sleep for an hour, 2 hours. Couldn't. This medicine, I finally took it. It kicked in, and I started noticing myself start to drowse off because the pain was gone. And so I thank God that I was born in a time where and I had access to simple over the counter medicine. Like that is a huge deal. That God put us in a time where we have access to that. God gave us people who were intelligent enough to figure out, hey, this has this reaction with your body, and if you take it, and you can take it this way, and it's safe, and not to overdose, and things like that. Like all of that, we just like, and I'm guilty of it too, but we just skim over as, no, this is just stuff that we do. Like, no, like this can't happen without God. Especially as a Christian, I think we need to realize that. So that was a little bit of a tangent, but we'll get back to it. Verse 9. When a case of serious skin disease may have developed on a person, he is to be brought to the priest. The priest will examine him. If there is a white swelling on the skin that has turned the hair white, and there is a patch of raw flesh in the swelling, it is a chronic serious disease of the skin of his body, and the priest must pronounce him unclean. He need not quarantine him, for he is unclean. If the skin disease breaks out all over the skin, so that it covers all the skin of the stricken person from his head to his feet, so far as the priest can see, the priest will look, and if the skin disease has covered his entire body, he is to pronounce the stricken person clean. Since he has turned totally white, he is clean. But whenever raw flesh appears on him, he will be unclean. When the priest examines the raw flesh, he must pronounce him unclean. Raw flesh is unclean. This is a serious skin disease, but if the raw flesh changes and turns white, he is to go to the priest. The priest will examine him, and if the sore has turned white, the priest must pronounce the stricken person clean. He is clean. When a boil appears on the skin of somebody's body, and it heals, and a white swelling or a reddish white spot develops where the boil was, the person is to present himself to the priest. The priest will make an examination of, and if the spot seems to be beneath the skin, and the hair in it has turned white, the priest must pronounce him unclean. It is a case of serious skin disease that is broken out in the boil. But when the priest examines it, if there is no white hair in it, and it is not beneath the skin, but is faded, the priest will quarantine him 7 days. If it spreads further on the skin, the priest must pronounce him unclean. It is in fact a disease, but if the spot remains where it is and does not spread, it is only the scar from the boil. The priest is to pronounce him clean. When there is a burn on the skin of one's body produced by fire, and the patch made raw by the burn becomes reddish white or white, the priest is to examine it. If the hair in the spot has turned white, and the spot appears to be deeper than the skin, it is a serious skin disease that has broken out in the burn. The priest must pronounce him unclean. It is a serious skin disease, but when the priest examines it, if there is no white hair in the spot, it is not beneath the skin, but is faded, the priest will quarantine him 7 days. The priest will re-examine him on the 7th day. If it has spread further on the skin, the priest must pronounce him unclean. It is in fact a case of serious skin disease, but if the spot has remained where it has, and has not spread on the skin, but is faded, it is the swelling from the burn. The priest is to pronounce him clean, for it is only the scar from the burn. When a man or woman has a condition on the head or chin, the priest is to examine the condition. If it appears to be deeper than the skin, and the hair in it is yellow or sparse, the priest must pronounce the person clean, or unclean. If it is scaly, it is a scaly outbreak, a serious skin disease of the head or chin. When the priest examines the scaly condition, if it does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and there is no black hair in it, the priest will quarantine the person with the scaly condition for 7 days. Priest will re-examine the condition on the seventh day. If the scaly outbreak has not spread and there is no yellow hair in it and it does not appear to be deeper than the skin, the person is to shave himself but not shave the scaly area. Then the priest will quarantine the person who has the scaly outbreak for another 7 days. The priest will examine the scaly outbreak on the seventh day, and if it has not spread on the skin and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, the priest is to pronounce the person clean. He is to wash his clothes, and he will be clean. But if the scaly outbreak spreads further on the skin after his cleansing, the priest is to examine the person. If the scaly outbreak has spread on the skin, the priest does not need to look for yellow hair. The person is unclean. But if, as far as he can see, the scaly outbreak remains unchanged, and black hair has grown in it, then he has healed. He is clean. The priest has pronounced the person clean. When a man or woman has white spots on the skin of the body, the priest is to make an examination. If the spots on the skin of the body are dull white, it is only a rash that has broken out on the skin. The person is clean. If a man loses the hair of his head, he is bald, but he is clean. If you got any bald friends, make sure you let them know that they're clean. Their baldness does not make them unclean. Oh. Verse 41. Or if he loses the hair at his hairline, he is bald on his forehead, but he is clean. But if there is a reddish white condition on the bald head or forehead, it is a serious skin disease breaking out on his head or forehead. I need to be careful because we'll get to the story later. But a lot of people don't realize there's a story in the Bible where I'm blanking. I've got a lot of mind fog right now. There's a priest who's coming down. I'm not even going to say it because I'm going to get it wrong. But he's coming down from this mountain, and there's these kids that run up and make fun of him because he's bald. And God sends two she-bears from the woods to maul the kids. Touch not the Lord's anointed, I guess. Okay, verse 43. The priest is to examine him, and if the swelling of the condition of his bald head or forehead is reddish white, like the appearance of a serious skin disease on the body, the man is afflicted with serious skin disease, he is unclean. The priest must pronounce him unclean, the infection is on his head. The person who has a case of serious skin disease is to have his clothes torn and his hair hanging loose. He must cover his mouth and cry out, unclean, unclean. He will remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He must live alone in a place outside the camp. So this is, later on in the Gospels, there's a story of Jesus healing a leper. And I think, so The Chosen's come under a lot of controversy. I think pretty much all of it is stupid. But I think they did a good job of showing the emotion here. And they do put some things there that you don't get simply by reading the text, but I think are accurate, and they help us realize what's going on. So as an example, in that scene, you see Jesus puts his hands on this man to heal him of the leprosy. And as soon as Jesus puts his hand on the man, he breaks down. Well, why is that? Because he's had this happen. He's been away from people. He's had to stay outside of the city, and he has to yell, unclean, 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 everywhere he goes. Right? He has not had human contact. And then finally Jesus shows up, and Jesus goes and actually puts his hands on him. That is a huge thing for this man. So this is also helping set context for what we see later on in the Gospels and such. Verse 47, if a fabric is contaminated with mildew in wool or linen fabric, in the warp or the weft of the linen or wool or the leather or anything made of leather, and if the contamination is green or red in the fabric, the leather, the warp, the weft, or any leather article, it is a mildew contamination. It is to be shown to the priest. The priest is to examine the contamination and quarantine the contaminated fabric for 7 days. The priest is to re-examine the contamination on the seventh day. If it has spread in the fabric, the warp, the weft, or the leather, regardless of how it is used, the contamination is harmful mildew, it is unclean. He is to burn the fabric, the warp or weft in wool or linen or any other leather article that is contaminated. Since it is harmful mildew, it must be burned. When the priest examines it, if the contamination has not spread in the fabric, the warp or weft, or any leather article, the priest is to order whatever is contaminated to be washed and quarantined for another 7 days. After it has been washed, the priest is to re-examine the contamination. If the appearance of the contaminated article has not changed, it is unclean, even though the contamination has not spread. You must burn the fabric. It is a fungus on the front or back of the fabric. So again, this is kind of some practical tips on getting rid, like if mildew or something starts to grow on material, they couldn't Google it to see what it was. They couldn't take a picture and have it analyzed to see what it was. They couldn't scrape off a sample and send it to a lab to see if it's like how bad it is or if it can just be washed or anything like that. So this is God giving them some practical steps on how to handle this stuff to help promote cleanliness, hygiene, health overall. Verse 56, if the priest examines it and the contamination is faded after it has been washed, he is to cut the contaminated section out of the fabric, the leather or the warp or weft. But if it reappears in the fabric, the warp or weft, or any leather article it has broken out again, you must burn whatever is contaminated, but the contamination disappears from the fabric, the warp or weft, or any leather article which have been washed, it is to be washed again, and it will be clean. This is the new law concerning a mildew contamination in the wool or linen fabric, warp or weft, or any leather article, in order to pronounce it clean or unclean. Chapter 14. The Lord spoke to Moses, this is the law concerning the person afflicted with a skin disease on the day of his cleansing. He is to be brought to the priest. He will go outside the camp and examine him. If the skin disease has disappeared from the afflicted person, the priest will order that 2 live clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop be brought for the one who is to be cleansed. Then the priest will order that one of the birds be slaughtered over the fresh water in a clay pot. He is to take the live bird together with the cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop, and dip them all into the blood of the bird that was slaughtered over the fresh water. He will then sprinkle the blood 7 times on the one who is to be cleansed from the skin disease. He is to pronounce him clean and release the live bird over the open countryside. The one who is to be cleansed must wash his clothes, shave off all his hair, and bathe with water. He is clean. Afterward he may enter the camp, but he must remain outside the tent for 7 days. He is to shave off all his hair again on the 7th day, his head, his beard, his eyebrows, and the rest of his hair is to wash his clothes and bathe himself with water. He is clean. On the 8th day he must take 2 unblemished male lambs, an unblemished year-old ewe lamb, a grain offering of 6 quarts of fine flour with olive oil, and 1/3 of a quart of olive oil. The priest who performs the cleansing will place the person who is to be cleansed together with these offerings before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest is to take 1 male lamb and present it as a guilt offering, along with 1/3 quart of olive oil, and he will present them as a presentation offering before the Lord. He is to slaughter the male lamb at the place of the sanctuary where the sin offering and burnt offering are slaughtered. For like the sin offering, the guilt offering belongs to the priest. It is especially holy. The priest is to take some of the blood from the guilt offering and put it on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, on the big toe of his right foot. Then the priest will take some of the 1/3 quart of olive oil and pour it onto his left palm. The priest will dip his right finger into the oil in his palm and sprinkle some of the oil in his fingers 7 times before the Lord. From the oil remaining in his palm, the priest will put some on the lobe of the right ear and of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, on top of the blood of the guilt offering. What is left of the oil in the priest's palm? What is left of the oil in the priest's palm? He is to put on the head of the one to be cleansed. In this way the priest will make atonement for him before the Lord. The priest is to sacrifice the sin offering and make atonement for the one to be cleansed from his uncleanness. Afterward, he will slaughter the burnt offering. The priest is to offer the burnt offering and the grain offering on the altar. The priest will make atonement for him, and he will be clean. But if he is poor and cannot afford these, he is to take one male lamb for a guilt offering to be presented in order to make atonement for him, along with 2 quarts of fine flour mixed with olive oil for a grain offering, 1/3 of a quart of olive oil, and 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, whatever he can afford, one to be a sin offering and the other to be a burnt offering. So again, this is we see God kind of providing a way for this to happen regardless of socioeconomic status of the individual, which is good. On the 8th day he is to bring these things for his cleansing to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting before the Lord. The priest will take the male lamb for a guilt offering and the 1/3 quart of olive oil and present them as a presentation offering before the Lord. After he slaughters the male lamb for the guilt offering, the priest is to take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the right earlobe of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. Then the priest will pour some of the oil onto his left palm. With his right finger, the priest will sprinkle some of the oil in his left palm 7 times before the Lord. The priest will also put some of the oil in his palm on his right earlobe of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, on the same place as the blood of the guilt offering. What is left of the oil in the priest's palm he is to put on the head of the one to be cleansed to make atonement for him before the Lord. He is to then sacrifice one type of what he can afford, either the turtle doves or the young pigeons, one as a sin offering, the other as a burnt offering, sacrificing what he can afford together with a grain offering. In this way the priest will make atonement before the Lord for the one to be cleansed. This is the law for someone who has a skin disease and cannot afford the cost of his cleansing. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, when you enter the land of Canaan that I am giving you as a possession, and I place the mildew contamination in a house in the land you possess, the owner of the house is to come and tell the priest, something like mildew contamination has appeared in my house. The priest must order them to clear the house before he enters to examine the contamination, so that nothing in the house becomes unclean. Afterwards the priest will come to examine the house. This is, I talked about a couple days ago, as far as like cleaning the house, and he will examine it, and if the contamination in the walls of the house consists of green and red indentations that appear to be beneath the surface of the wall, the priest is to go outside the house to its doorway and quarantine the house for 7 days. The priest is to return on the 7th day and examine it. If the contamination is spread on the walls of the house, the priest must order that the stones with contamination be pulled out and thrown into an unclean place outside the city. He is to have the inside of the house completely scraped and have the plaster that is scraped off dumped in an unclean place outside the city. Then they are to take different stones to replace the former ones and take additional plaster to replaster the house. If the contamination reappears in the house after the stones have been pulled out and after the house has been scraped and replastered, the priest is to come and examine it. If the contamination is spread in the house, it is a harmful mildew and the house is unclean. It must be torn down with its stones and beams and all its plaster and taken outside the city to an unclean place. Whoever enters the house during any of the days of the priest quarantines it will be unclean until evening. Whoever lies down in the house is to wash his clothes, and whoever eats in it is to wash his clothes. But when the priest comes and examines it, if the contamination has not spread in the house after it was replastered, he is to pronounce the house clean, because the contamination has disappeared. He is to take 2 birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop to purify the house, and he is to slaughter one of the birds over a clay pot containing fresh water. He will take the cedar wood, the hyssop, the scarlet yarn, the live bird, dip them in the blood of the slaughtered bird and the fresh water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. He will purify the house with the blood of the bird, the fresh water, the live bird, the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the scarlet yarn. Then he is to release the live bird into the open countryside outside the city. In this way he will make atonement for the house, and it will be clean. This is a law for any skin disease or mildew for a scaly outbreak, for the mildew in clothing or on a house, and for a swelling scab or spot, to determine when something is unclean or clean. This is a law regarding skin disease and mildew. Okay, I am rushing through this a little bit. My camera keeps shutting off. I don't know what's going on, so I'm just trying to get this knocked out so I can figure that out. Chapter 15. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, speak to the Israelites and tell them, when any man has a discharge from his member, he is unclean. This is uncleanness of his discharge, whether his member secretes the discharge or retains it. He is unclean all the days of his member secretes or retains anything because of his discharge. He is unclean. And he bed the man with the discharge lies on will be unclean, and any furniture he sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches his bed is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. Whoever sits on furniture that the man with the discharge was sitting on is to wash clothes and bathe with the water, and he will remain unclean until evening. So, a lot of this remaining unclean until evening, again, ties into this practicality, I think. That gives time for you to see if they start showing symptoms as well. We do that here in our house when people are sick. We will quarantine them, separate them from the people that are not sick, and if someone has in contact, then we kind of put them to another place, and we have a lot of kids, so it's very tricky trying to quarantine and all that. But we do this now. We don't say that it's a command from God, but it's a practical thing to do. Quarantine so disease and stuff doesn't spread. Where are we at? Verse 7. Whoever touches the body of the man with a discharge is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. If the man with a discharge spits on anyone who is clean, he is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. Any saddle the man with a discharge rides on will be unclean. Whoever touches anything that was under him will be unclean until evening. And whoever carries such things is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. If the man with the discharge touches anyone without first rinsing his hand in water, the person who is touched is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. Any clay pot that the man with the discharge touches must be broken, while any wooden utensil is to be rinsed with water. While the man with the discharge has been cured of it, he is to count 7, or when the man with the discharge has been cured of it, he is to count 7 days for his cleansing, wash his clothes, and bathe his body in fresh water. He will be clean but he must take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons on the 8th day, come before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and give them to the priest. The priest is to sacrifice them. One is a sin offering, the other is a burnt offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement for him before the Lord because of his discharge. When a man has an emission of... You can read that. I'm trying to get around YouTube censors. He is to bathe himself completely with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. Any clothing or leather on which there is an emission of the same stuff is to be washed with water, and it will remain unclean until evening. If a man sleeps with a woman and has an emission, both of them are to bathe with water, and they will remain unclean until evening. When a woman has a discharge and it consists of blood from her body, she will be unclean because of her menstruation. For 7 days, everyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. Anything she lies on during her menstruation will become unclean, and anything she sits on will become unclean. Everyone who touches her bed is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. Everyone who touches any furniture she was sitting on is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. If discharge is on the bed or on the furniture she was sitting on when he touches it, he will be unclean until evening. If a man sleeps with her and blood from her menstruation gets on him, he will be unclean for 7 days, and every bed he lies on will become unclean. When a woman has a discharge of her blood for many days, though it is not the time of her menstruation, or if she has a discharge beyond her period, she will be unclean all the days of her unclean discharge, as she is during the days of her menstruation. Any bed she lies on during the days of her discharge will be like her bed during menstrual impurity. Any furniture she sits on will be unclean as her menstrual period. Everyone who touches them will be unclean. He must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. When she is cured of her discharge, she is to count 7 days, and after that she will be clean. On the 8th day, she must take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest is to sacrifice one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement for her before the Lord because of her unclean discharge. You must keep the Israelites from their uncleanness so that they do not die by defiling my tabernacle that is among them. This is the law for someone with a discharge, a man who has an emission of, becoming unclean by it, a woman who is in her menstrual period, anyone who has a discharge, whether male or female, and a man who sleeps with a woman who is unclean. Okay. It's quite the passage. So, we're coming up on the end of Leviticus. We've only got, let's see, I think I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 days left. So we're moving right along, and I'm thinking about coming back and maybe going through and doing a little bit of a deeper dive in Leviticus. I've got some other stuff planned, so if I do, it'll probably be kind of towards the end of the year. But we'll see. We'll see what I'm able to do and what I'm able to get done. But right now, what I'm able to get done are these questions. So let's jump into those. Question 1. What do the laws regarding leprosy and bodily discharges teach us about the concept of purity and its importance in our relationship with God? So, again, this a lot of Leviticus ties back to this, the importance of holiness, and purity is an element of that. And we trying to get ourselves in a state, at least at the time, trying to get themselves in a state where they could go to be in the presence of God without dying. Now, we are able to do that now without going through all these extra steps because of the blood of Jesus that washes us clean. But this goes to show how important it is and how unholy we are and how unclean we are by comparison to God. It goes to show the amount of space that's between us that we will never be able to make up for. Question 2. How can we apply the principles of healing and restoration found in these chapters to our own lives and communities today? I talked about that a little bit. Kind of the idea of quarantine. If someone is sick and having some of these things, they quarantine. That's what we do now. We have, one of the reasons that I got the flu a week or so ago was because I had a son that had the flu, and he couldn't do anything for himself. I didn't want to spread to other people, and so he stayed in one room, and I went and helped him. I got what he needed. I was checking his temperature. I was giving him medicine as he needed, and everyone else stayed out of that room. And even me, because I was in contact with him, I cut down on my contact with other people in our household so that we wouldn't spread it. So, it's really, there's a lot of practical stuff in here. There is a lot of spiritual implications as well, but there's a lot of practical stuff in here. Question 3. In what ways do you think that these ancient laws reflect God's care for both the individual and communal well-being? Again, this really goes to the idea of keeping people healthy, keeping people safe, cutting down on the amount of people that would be affected by disease and outbreak and things like that. And especially in this day and age when they didn't have medicine and stuff like we do today. A flu could be deadly. The cold could be deadly. Like there were so many things that could take you out. And so this was a lot of practicality that really helped the Israelites to be healthy and flourish beyond, I think, really anybody around. I think that is it for today. Appreciate you watching, listening, commenting. If you comment, all that, it really helps. The algorithms show that people are interested in this. They like this stuff. They want to see more of this. And it pushes these types of videos and content to other people as well. Spread the word. If this has been a blessing to you, then spread the word. Word of mouth is the best way that podcasts spread. And my goal is to ultimately be actually doing this full time. And so eventually, God willing, if that happens, then I'll be able to actually do much more content and other things. A lot of big plans that I have will be able to kind of be realized if that happens. So if this has been a blessing to you, pass it along, share it to other people. I hope it continues to bless you, and it's been good. We're wrapping up Leviticus, but getting into Numbers next, and then Deuteronomy. It's gonna be there's some very interesting passages coming up in the next couple books, and we'll give a quick overview of those and how we can read those and what they maybe mean for us today. So yeah, I think that is it. So I hope it blesses you. Hope it's been a blessing to you. We'll see you tomorrow. God bless.